Hi, welcome to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. It is Monday, January 5th, and I'm Jessica Steinberg. I'm speaking today with political reporter Ariela Karmel and archaeology reporter Rossella Tercatin. Hi, Ariela. We're starting with you this morning.
Hi, Jessica.
Hi there. It is day 822 of the war. Just to give a brief roundup of the headlines this morning, the fifth round of talks between Israel and Syria will reportedly start today in Paris. Those are the first meetings in some 2 months after progress toward a security arrangement between the two countries stalled. The talks were one of the several topics discussed between Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and U.S. President Donald Trump last week in Mar-a-Lago in Florida. The two leaders also appear aligned on their Iran messaging that came out yesterday. As a second week of demonstrations began in Iran, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said yesterday that the Iranian people could be or perhaps are taking their fate into their own hands. Meanwhile, President Trump warned that Iran could get hit very hard if more protesters die. Reports are that some 16 protesters have been killed in the protests in Iran. The ultra-Orthodox Shas party threatened the stability of the coalition government yesterday, saying it would not vote for the 2026 state budget without the prior passage of the coalition's bill regulating Haredi conscription and exemptions. We will talk about some politics with Ariela, but the latest issue out of the Prime Minister's office, which has to do with photos being touched up with AI. Ariela will take us through that. And when Rossella joins us later, she will take us through the latest version of another government bill whose purpose is to extend Israeli authority over antiquities and heritage sites in the West Bank. So stay with us. We'll be back in a moment.
3 million Israelis are dealing with trauma since October 7th. To help Israelis heal, Hadassah is there, with the largest rehabilitation center in Jerusalem, world-renowned medical centers, and youth villages. It's said, saving a life saves the world. Imagine helping millions. This is Hadassah, a life-changing force in Israel and the world.
Okay, Ariela. So yesterday, you dove into this issue that's been out there for a couple of days, really percolating. I'm going to just give a quick intro, but you will give us all the details that we need to know. So the Prime Minister's office, that is Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's office, has come under fire for sending out official photos in which his wife, Sara Netanyahu, in which her image has been heavily retouched, seemingly sometimes with AI, with artificial intelligence technology. And that is obviously of a great issue in terms of the historical record, ethical guidelines. You took the deep dive yesterday and came out with a story about it. So tell it to us from whatever perspective makes sense to you, from how you waded into it or what you found.
So for the Israeli public and within Israeli media, the issue of the Prime Minister's wife in particular retouching, and when I say retouching, I mean noticeably, visibly, digitally altering photos of herself, has been going on for a long time. It's kind of something of a joke within Israeli media and across the Israeli public. However, until recently, those photos had been restricted to her personal social media uses or those of her friends. It wasn't something that you saw on official state channels. And in recent months, we have been seeing, and Israeli media has been commenting on how noticeable many photos that don't just include Sara Netanyahu, but include her husband, the prime minister, and other state figures, including President Trump, at historic meetings, appear visibly edited and retouched to make her look younger. And this wasn't being acknowledged or credited for a long time. And then recently, in, I suppose, the last couple of weeks, journalists started to notice that they were receiving photos from the Prime Minister's office and from the government press office, in which photos of Sarah included a credit to Sara, which doesn't make sense. She couldn't have been, she's not a photographer.
Taking the photo and being in the photos also.
Exactly. And so what has come out is that these are photos in which she, of course, did not take them, but they were digitally altered, sometimes using AI, on her behalf. And this is kind of a compromise, listing her as a credit on these photos after there was there was an uproar essentially within the government press office, which is essentially, among many other things, supposed to be the state archive for documenting the heads of state, the prime minister and the president. And photographers were complaining that photos that they had taken were then being digitally altered without their consent. They say that they have nothing to do with that, and they wanted it to be at least tacitly acknowledged in some way that this photo had been altered and that it had been altered by a third party. So this was the compromise, apparently, that was reached between the prime minister's office and the government press office.
But there was never an announcement made that this was happening.
No, never. This has all been unearthed, shall we say, through Israeli journalists and their communications with various parties within the government press office, the prime minister's office, and elsewhere. I spoke to the Netanyahu, who is the director of the government press office, and he stated very clearly that they have had nothing to do with any altered images. The department
They receive them and then they pass them on.
While, according to him, they don't distribute them either. However, we know that there are GPO newsletters that many of our staff members and most Israeli international journalists use, and WhatsApp groups where these photos are being disseminated with the credit to Sara. So it's a little unclear what's going on here, but what we know is that there are a lot of conversations still ongoing between the PMO and the GPO to find some kind of resolution to this
Ariela,
issue.
what the GPO, which again, government press office, what is its status? Is it who's in charge of them? In other words, under what umbrella organization do they sit?
So they're a state office. They are not supposed to be subordinate to the PMO. They don't sit under the prime minister's office. They're an organ of the state. You could say they have parallel powers to the PMO. They work with them closely, but they aren't supposed to answer to the PMO. But obviously it's a very delicate dance because they have to work closely in tandem. Apparently the Justice Ministry is also reviewing this issue. That's what Netanyahu told me. And so that maybe could add you would hope, at least an objective third party stance. But the Justice Ministry, as is every ministry, is also a political body whose leader is a member of the government. So it's complex.
And just to sort of round it all up, we are not using those photos. We and other media bodies.
No, we don't use those photos. They are showed in the article
yes,
that I published
in your
yesterday.
article, you show them just to give an example of, I was going to mention that, just to give an example of what we're talking about here. This very stark difference between the photo as it was taken by perhaps one of the photo agencies and the photo that was sent by the PMO, by the Prime Minister's office, with the touch-up.
Yes, exactly. And I will just say the criticism and the significance of it is that this has been going on likely for a long time without anyone, without any even tacit acknowledgement.
Meaning none of the Sara Netanyahu credit, obviously.
Well, the digital altering of state photos without any kind of credit, which is the tacit acknowledgement. And it was something that people were just speculating about. And so this is kind of a confirmation that this has been going on for a very long time. And we don't actually know to what extent it's continued.
And how far back it went.
Exactly. And it's an issue because these state bodies are supposed to provide a historic, accurate, unbiased record of the state for posterity. And it's very problematic if you have photos of state, even to families of heads of state and, of course, heads of state themselves that are not accurate and not trustworthy. And it actually brings into question the entire integrity and trustworthiness of this institution, and therefore the historical record that we as a country are supposed to rely on.
Okay. Thanks for taking us through that. Appreciate it, Ariela.
My pleasure.
We're going to let you go off to the Knesset now for a day of reporting.
Thanks, Jessica.
What if prayer doesn't work? This question strikes us as a distinctly modern one, an outgrowth of the slow disenchantment of the world. But in truth, the question is an old one, and one given space to breathe here.
Welcome to Thoughts and Prayers. I'm your host, Jessica Fisher. Join me on a deep exploration of the relationship between religion and modernity through personal stories, classical texts, and conversations with leading rabbis, scholars, and educators.
You're almost not supposed to be doing this interview.
Our prayers accumulate on God's doorstep, piled outside like an unimaginably tall stack of letters. We cannot give up on the relationship because God doesn't come to the door as quickly as we may like. So let's keep knocking. Perhaps the gates of compassion will be opened.
Join us every week on Thoughts and Prayers, wherever you get your podcasts.
Okay, so we're back from the break, and now we have Rossella with us. Hi, Rossella. How are you?
Hello. Good.
Hello.
How are you doing?
I'm okay. Happy to have some sunshine outside. Let's get to what you dove into after a very extensive look at this entire issue back in the summer, I believe. Okay, so I'm going to lay it out for us. So you wrote up a couple of days ago a new version of a bill, of a bill in the Knesset, whose purpose is to extend Israeli authority over antiquities and heritage sites in the West Bank. Including, its aim would be to include areas A and B, where the Palestinian Authority has civilian control. And it's the main sponsor of the bill is Likud MK Amit Halevi, and who also now requested in the notes of the bill that the new law be applied also to the Gaza Strip. And that is as of now, as of end of December. But the overarching issue here is that the critics of the bill, and you will tell us much more about it, the critics of the bill say that this is the intention of this bill is of the Likud, of the coalition, well, of the Likud sponsor of the bill, to really create much more of a sense of control, of Israeli control over the West Bank, by also having control of these antiquities and heritage sites. So there's a lot of politics here. And your original July piece, which of course we'll link to, really goes in depth. That feature goes in depth into your conversations with people from the Israel Antiquities Authority, with people from Kogat, who are archaeologists, with basically archaeologists in a sense across the spectrum in academia, as well as the Knesset members, as well as the politicians, who of course are not archaeologists. So why don't you actually take us back to July?
Yes.
And tell us what prompted your writing of that very major feature at the time.
Yeah, so, archaeology, antiquities in the West Bank is such a fascinating, fraught, incredible topic because there are so many layers, to it essentially. Like, now you're just mostly focused on the political layer,
Right.
but, the question, and it is political, and it is also about, ultimately the lives of the people who live in the West Bank and Israelis and Palestinians. But there is also this incredible aspect of so much history has happened in the West Bank.
Right.
And of course, a lot of people, and especially bringing a little bit of politics into it, like to focus on how the West Bank was really, the place where where the Jewish people's ancestors, forefathers, like moved around, and there's Hebron and there's Shem, and even before there was Jerusalem. So
Right.
obviously there's and the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, and a lot of it was
It was
in the
all, a
West
lot of it was
Bank.
there in that
And,
place.
and then history did not stop there. Clearly, there were, and the Asmonean, and then there were, the Romans, the Byzantines, the Christian period, the Islamic period, and so on and so forth, up until essentially, even the British period and the 67 war. Like, so there's a lot of history there, and there's a lot of, and it's very like emotional and exciting for people, while at the same time thinking about all this history and antiquities that are there, and at the same time, all of these kind of like blends with the political situation. So I think that last February 2025, there was a big academic conference, international conference about archaeology in the West Bank, which of course was called Conference about Archaeology in Judea and Samaria, which is the biblical name of the West Bank, and it's also what is prevalent in Israeli public discourse nowadays. Most politicians would say Judah and Shamron, Judea and Samaria, as opposed to the West Bank. So from that moment, which was kind of like groundbreaking, because you had really archaeologists and academics even from abroad who came, and it was sort of like a first. Why? Because the question like goes back to what is the status of Israeli rule over the West Bank. Now, we know that most of the international community calls the West Bank occupied territory. What does Israel say? It's not so clear, because Israel would sometimes, Israeli leaders or politicians would sometimes say the West Bank is ours. It's not exactly clear what legally that means, but that's what they say. If you look at where that was also one of the things that sparked my piece, is which laws that does Israel apply to the West Bank? Israel, to a great extent, actually applied international law that applied to occupied territories.
They use that kind of legal
law.
terminology and law in the West Bank.
Yes, that's exactly that applies, especially when it comes to the territory, the Palestinians, less so Israeli civilians. For sure, ultimately, the West Bank is under a military rule, and that means that there is a special department, the civil administration, which is a department of the Ministry of Defense, but it's staffed with Israeli army personnel and also civilian personnel that is in charge of civilian affairs. And even when, like, to the citizens of Israel living in the West Bank in the settlement, the Israeli in many cases Israeli law is not applied so like straight. Is applied through a mechanism of the civil administration, and that even more so for the Palestinians. So according to the prevalent interpretation of international law, when a country is not, let's say, the sovereign country in a territory, to avoid deciding to call it occupied,
Right.
the country is not allowed to conduct academic excavations and research. They can only do savage excavation and activities to preserve what's there. Let's say a road needs to be built. In order to build a road, you need to, excavate the foundation and or buildings and everything. Let's say there are antiquities; those antiquities needs to be excavated and protected.
Okay.
But it is not clear whether Israel has authority to do more than that, and a lot of people say no. Now, a lot of people say
Who
yes.
are those? A lot of people. Which people say no and which people say yes?
So, I mean, I would say that, again, the prevalent interpretation of international law, and this means a lot of also academics abroad and archaeologists abroad, that's what they maintain. I would say that also in Israel, and some of the archaeologists I spoke with, for example, Aaron Meir, who is the head of the Archaeology Institute of Bar Ilan University, says that that's how he views the question. But just to explain how complicated it is, he says that, for example, as the person in charge of signing off archaeological excavation, if a colleague of his wants to excavate academical in the West Bank, so research, and he needs to sign it off, he would sign it off because he says that's the way I personally feel and look at the law. But I think that it's enough of a gray area to say I'm not going to prevent someone from doing it. There's also a question of what is a savage excavation. Now, everyone agrees, right, left, everyone agrees that there's a lot of antiquities damage and looting and problems with preserving antiquities in the West Bank.
Okay.
Some people put
Could you give an
squarely-
example, Rossella? Like,
So, for example, we were discussing last week, right, or a few days ago, Irkania, the Asmonean fortress where they found that wonderful mold to create little souvenirs for pilgrims. Irkania is an Asmonean fortress in the West Bank. It has suffered, and Sartaba, another Asmonean fortress in the West Bank. They have suffered for decades, if not probably even hundreds of years of looting and damage. At Sartaba that I even visited, you can see the big
there's
holes.
not really upkeep of that site
No.
because it is in that area of the West Bank.
Because listen, let's be honest. Looting and damage to archaeological excavation and antiquities exists also within Israeli sovereign territory. It exists all over the world. I'm from Italy. It definitely exists in Italy. I think from, anyone in any part of the world where there are ancient treasures that people might want to pay a lot of money for, there's going to be people who try to exploit it. But obviously, when there is less of a clear-cut authority and a clear-cut priority in preventing it, there's more. And that is the case of the West Bank. So everyone agrees. Some people more to the right say that the Palestinians are to blame. Some people who are more, let's say, less politically charged in what they say there's a lot of Palestinians, there's also some Israelis. It's a problem, and everyone agrees it would be good to find a solution. Now,
Sure.
what people disagree with, what is the solution? So, for example, in the case of these two Asmonean fortresses, archaeologists from Hebrew University and from Bar Ilan felt that it was the right thing to excavate because otherwise, ultimately, the looters and the vandals would destroy everything before archaeologists got to it. But some people would say it's a stretch, like just put a fence, put cameras, prevent everyone from getting to these sites and just leave them there, because that's what preserving archaeology in a place that is disputed, that is what it looks like. You don't need to do more than that.
Okay, Rossella,
So-
I want to bring you back now, though, to the bill
Yes.
that we're talking about. And in other words, there will be disputes about this bill. What are some of the issues that are going to arise as a result of this bill?
Absolutely. So the original version of the bill was like 2 lines long, essentially, and wanted to extend the powers of the Israel Antiquities Authority, which is the body that is in charge of antiquities and archaeology within the 67 border, plus Jerusalem and the Golan Heights that Israel annexed in the 1980s. Just say, instead of saying in the law that gives these powers to the Israel Antiquities Authority, instead just say Israel. We're going to say Israel and the region means the West Bank, and that's what's going to happen. To explain the pushback, the Israel Antiquities Authority absolutely refused to receive the responsibility, mostly saying that this would really put Israeli archaeologists, every single archaeologist who wants to work in Israel needs to deal with the Israel Antiquities Authority, including from abroad. So they said, if we do that, a lot of people are not going to work with us anymore. It's going to be less archaeologists, less partnership with universities abroad, less funds. It's going to be very
They're not going to want to
problematic for
touch that
Israeli
issue with a 10-foot pole, as we would say.
So they said no. So Alevi came up with a new proposal, which is to create a new civilian body, which would have the powers of the Israel Antiquities Authorities, but also expanded, because the truth is right now there is an archaeology unit within the civil administration that has powers that are more extensive than those of the Israel Antiquities Authority, because ultimately, it's under military control. So certain
So
things are
therefore,
more
they just had more access. Okay.
Right. So the goal of the bill is to create this authority. Now, the problem, so you mentioned where does this apply? So now, to be honest, I'm not 100% sure that when the bill comes to the final form that is going to be voted on, Area A and B, let alone Gaza, are actually going to be included. Because right now, all of these are in the notes to the are in the notes to the draft of the bill that is gonna be discussed before the committee. But it says a lot because it says that
Just to even put it there.
exactly, like, because Israel does not, Israel does not do any civilian control in area A and B, and so it's like these kind of things would be like groundbreaking. And again, what a lot of
And
archaeologists are
it
saying,
politicizes it.
it politicizes it, and they say, if you want to annex the West Bank, don't try to use don't use the excuse of antiquities. It's take responsibility in a straight way. Now, what's kind of I don't know if amusing, but interesting to me is that it's not that Alevi or other Tzvi Sukkot, who is currently the new head of the Knesset Committee Education, the Knesset Education Committee from Otzma Yehudit are shy about saying that they do want to annex the West Bank completely, right? But they say here nobody can dispute that our heritage and our history should be under our control, and they also want to say the main issue to actually protect and develop antiquities in the West Bank is the budget. Now we have given a higher budget to the archaeology unit, so they're doing a better job. Everyone is saying that. But at the same time, the budget, when the government changes, the government can decide that they're going to give it another budget. While in this bill, we are enshrining the budget in law because it's a separate authority. So that's how they're. But again, it is very politicized. It is. Again, it's a good question how much of a priority the coalition is going to be put behind this bill, because there's a lot of backlash, including really most archaeologists who have
That's what I wanted to ask you. What are
against
IAA, Israeli Archaeology Association? Authority. What are
Authority.
they? What are the IAA archaeologists
So they have already
saying?
said. So the IAEA has already said they're against having their control and they're having this kind of power in the West Bank. So they're kind of like in a way out of the picture, because they are like a government body, although independent. So they don't want to be politicized. But I can tell you that Guy Stiebel, who is the head of the Archaeological Council of Israel, which is the body made up of academics who is in charge of advising government bodies on the issues of archaeology, including the IAEA, has spoken against this bill. They said it's gonna actually be worse for antiquities, because it's gonna be a new authority created out of nothing that before starts working well, even if it could, it's gonna take a long time. You already have the right system. Is it not clear how the civilian body is gonna interact with the military? It's just gonna be a disaster, and it's gonna bring us a lot of pushback at the international level, more boycott, less funding. And so it's going to be a disaster. So this is the position of the head of the Archaeological Council. Archaeologists from Ariel University, which sits in the West
Bank. Yeah.
also say basically the same things. Of course, it is possible there are individual archaeologists, with a reputable academic background who are in favor. I haven't encountered anybody yet, or people have not come to speak at the committee meetings that I have followed. But I'm not saying nobody, but the vast majority are definitely against it. It is possible that this bill is not going to go nowhere.
No, won't go anywhere, right?
But I think it is very indicative both of the political situation of Israel, all the layers that intersect, in the West Bank of history, connection, the life and right of the Palestinians, the Israeli settlements, and so on and so forth. And it is, so I think it is a very significant issue to keep an eye on.
Okay. Of course, we'll link to both of Rossella's articles about it, and I really advise you to take a good look at the feature, because it's fascinating and it dips into every single angle that you sort of touched on right now. So heads up for that great feature. Thank you, Rossella.
Thank you.
And thanks to you for listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. Stay tuned for tomorrow's installment. This episode is produced by the Podwaves. Until next time, take care, be well, and all those of you who start work on Monday, have a good week.